Adam Smith develops a foundational philosophy that fuses moral psychology, natural liberty, and early economic science into a unified vision of how free individuals can generate social order without central direction, grounding his thought in the idea that human beings are neither purely selfish nor purely altruistic, but are driven by a complex mix of self-interest, sympathy, and a desire for mutual approval, as laid out in the theory of moral sentiments. In this framework, individuals regulate their behavior through an impartial spectator, an internalized moral standard shaped by social interaction, which allows society to maintain moral order without heavy coercion. This moral foundation carries directly into his economics in The Wealth of Nations, where he argues that when individuals pursue their own interests within a system of secure property rights, free exchange, and competition, they unintentionally contribute to the broader good through what he famously describes as the invisible hand. Smith's central insight is that economic coordination does not require central planning, because the price system, shaped by supply and demand, transmits information about scarcity and value, guiding resources toward their most valued uses through decentralized decision-making. He emphasizes the division of labor as the primary driver of productivity and wealth, showing how specialization increases efficiency, but also warning that it can narrow the worker's mind, which is why he supports basic public education as a corrective. Smith is not a strict free market absolutist. While he strongly criticizes mercantilism, monopolies, tariffs, and government-granted privileges, which he sees as distortions that benefit elites at the expense of consumers. He allows for a limited but important role for government in defense, justice, infrastructure, and certain public goods that markets alone may not adequately provide. Economically, he rejects the idea that wealth comes from hoarding gold or controlling trade, instead defining wealth as the productive capacity of a nation and the real goods and services available to its people. And he views voluntary exchange as mutually beneficial rather than zero-sum. Smith is also deeply skeptical of concentrated economic power, particularly collusion among merchants and manufacturers, recognizing that private actors can undermine competition just as governments can, which is why he sees competition, not just freedom, but as essential to a healthy market order. Philosophically, his system rests on the idea of natural liberty, where individuals are free to pursue their own ends within a framework of justice, and where institutions should not artificially privilege one class over another. Unlike later thinkers, such as Mises or Friedman, Smith does not frame markets primarily in terms of calculation or efficiency, but rather as part of a broader moral and social order in which freedom, trust, and institutional stability allow complex cooperation to emerge organically. At the same time, he is realistic about human limitations. He understands that people can be short-sighted, that elites can capture power, and that unchecked systems, whether political or economic, can produce harm, which is why his vision is not anarchic, but institutionally grounded, balancing liberty with legal structure. In essence, Smith's contribution is to show that a society of free individuals, guided by self-interest but constrained by moral norms and fair rules, can produce prosperity and coordination without central design, making him the intellectual bridge between moral philosophy and modern economics. He takes the Lockean emphasis on individual rights and extends it into a full account of how markets transform individual striving into social wealth, while also recognizing that the legitimacy of that system depends on maintaining justice, competition, and a moral framework that prevents freedom from collapsing into exploitation or privilege. Adam Smith and John Locke are both foundational to classical liberalism, but they operate on different levels and solve different problems. Locke is primarily a political philosopher concerned with legitimacy. He asks where rights come from and concludes that individuals possess natural rights of life, liberty, and property, existing prior to government, and that government exists only to protect those rights through consent. His theory of property is moral and justificatory. Property becomes yours when you mix your labor with nature, and this forms the basis of individual independence and limits on state power. Smith, by contrast, is not trying to justify property from first principles. He largely assumes the institutional framework Locke helped establish, and instead asks a different question. How does a society of free individuals actually coordinate economic life and generate prosperity? His answer is the market process, like division of labor, exchange, and price signals, through which individuals pursuing their own interests unintentionally produce social order, what he calls the invisible hand. Where Locke focuses on rights and the moral limits of authority, Smith focuses on process and outcomes, how wealth is created, how incentives work, and how decentralized decisions coordinate without central control. They also differ in tone and realism about human behavior. Locke's framework is relatively clean and rights-based. Individuals are rational actors whose property rights create a stable political order. Smith is more psychologically complex. In the theory of moral sentiments, he argues that humans are driven not just by self-interest, but by sympathy, social approval, and moral judgment, which shape behavior alongside economic incentives. This leads Smith to be more attentive to institutions, norms, and unintended consequences. He is also less absolutist about the free market than many assume. While he strongly opposes mercantilism, monopolies, and state-granted privilege, he allows for a limited role for government in public goods, infrastructure, education, and justice, whereas Locke's framework is more strictly about protecting pre-existing rights. The cleanest way to distinguish them is this: Locke builds the moral foundation of a free society, why freedom is justified, why individuals have rights, and why government is limited. Smith builds the functional explanation, he puts it into effect, how a society based on those principles actually works in practice and produces prosperity.